Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Saga of the Swamp Thing, Book 2. Now, this is Volume 2 of Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. Now, the character of Swamp Thing was originally created by Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson. Now, Alan Moore took over this series in 1983 or 1984, and his run lasted until 1987, and during those years, he reinvented the character so much that his run on Swamp Thing is almost its own separate series. Now, even though these comics were originally published by DC, eventually they were all put together into a 6-volume graphic novel series, which was published by Vertigo, which is an imprint of DC. Now, I just reviewed Volume 1, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out that review. Now, most of the issues collected in here were illustrated by Stephen Passett and John Tolobin. However, there are 2 issues in here illustrated by Sean McManus. I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name right, and there's one issue in here illustrated by Rick Veitch. And then there's an issue in here illustrated by Ron Randall. Now, this volume features what I would call the Arcane story arc. This features the return of Anton Arcane, who was a major villain from the older Swamp Thing comics before Alan Moore took over. Now, from what I understand, Arcane is basically to Swamp Thing what the Joker is to Batman, or what Lex Luthor is to Superman. Like, he's considered to be Swamp Thing's greatest antagonist. And he's also the uncle of Abby, who is a major protagonist in this series. Now, Arcane was killed before the events of Loose Ends, which was the first issue of Alan Moore's run on this series. But basically what happens in this story arc, and you saw the Monkey King story arc from the previous volume sort of lead into this, Arcane has now come back from hell as a demon, and he takes possession of Matt Cable, who is Abby's husband. Now, Matt actually does have supernatural powers. He has the ability to make his thoughts physically manifest themselves, and of course Arcane uses this to his advantage while he's possessing Matt. And Arcane has now freed the souls of long-dead serial killers, and it seems like he's planning on essentially freeing all the damned souls from hell, or at least the most evil souls in hell. At the same time, he sends his own niece, Abby, to hell, and this is all to fuck with Swamp Thing. And of course, Swamp Thing is limited in how much he can fight Arcane, because Arcane is also possessing his friend. Now, this volume opens up with an issue called The Burial, which is really important, and it does lead into the Arcane story arc, but the Arcane story really starts with an issue called Love and Death. Now, Love and Death was actually pretty revolutionary for the time. I'm not sure if it was the first, but I know it was one of the first comic book issues to go out without the Comics Code approval. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Comics Code Authority was something established in the mid-50s after all this controversy surrounding the EC comics and horror comics in general. And child psychiatrist Frederick Wortham was going around claiming that comic books were the cause of juvenile delinquency, but especially horror comics, and because of all this controversy, the comic book industry decided to make the Comics Code Authority, where basically all comic books from then on had to be essentially kid-friendly. Although it seems like by the 70s and early 80s, they were getting a little looser with their rules. But as I said, this was one of the first comic books to go out without the Comics Code Authority's seal of approval, because, dear God, what happens in this issue is not kid-friendly at all. Because the issue opens up where you see Abby naked and bleeding on her kitchen floor, and she scrubbed herself with an iron brush to get clean. And the whole issue is told in flashback, and you realize that the reason she's scrubbing herself clean is because she found out that her husband was possessed by the spirit of her uncle, and they did have sex while he was possessing him. So basically Abby was raped by her own uncle. That was some really fucked up stuff to be doing in a comic book around this time, when people thought comic books were nothing but children's fare. And you really see how with this run, Alan Moore really did change the comic book industry and people's perceptions of comic books at the time. Now, the Arcane story leads into an issue called Down Amongst the Dead Men, which is basically a loose adaptation of Dante's The Divine Comedy. Basically, in this issue, Swamp Thing has to travel into hell to save Abby's soul. And this is where Alan Moore gets really heavy with a lot of the biblical undertones, because it's dealing with stuff like heaven and hell and the existence of God. And what's cool about it is, at first, Swamp Thing ends up in purgatory, and he meets Deadman, who is a character from other DC comics, who is the ghost of a murdered trapeze artist. And Deadman guides him through purgatory, whereas the Phantom Stranger guides him into heaven, and then when they get to hell, Edrican the Demon guides Swamp Thing through hell. And in this issue, you could almost look at Swamp Thing as being a stand-in for Dante, and you could look at Deadman, the Phantom Stranger, and Edrican as being stand-ins for Virgil and Beatrice from the Divine Comedy. And you get some interesting implications here, like, it's heavily implied that the Phantom Stranger is actually a fallen angel. And what's kind of cool about this issue is it works as both a sequel to the Arcane story and a sequel to the opening issue, The Burial. Now, in The Burial, Swamp Thing actually found the body of Alec Holland and buried it, and it's interesting because for years Swamp Thing thought he was Alec Holland. And in this issue, when Swamp Thing is in heaven, he sees Alec Holland, and it's a really weird situation because he's basically seeing himself in heaven. And this was the kind of psychological complexity that people were not expecting in comic books at the time. Now I want to talk about the last 3 issues that are collected in this volume, which, even though they're taking place after the Arcane story arc, they each stand on their own as individual stories. The first one is Pog, which you could say is taking place after Swamp Thing saves Abby from hell at the end of Down Amongst the Dead Men, but it really does stand on its own and feels isolated from the Arcane story arc. But this one is about a group of aliens who come to Earth looking for a new home, and they meet Swamp Thing, and they can't understand Swamp Thing's language, and you get the idea that Swamp Thing probably doesn't understand their language. And of all of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing stories, this is the one that feels the most cartoonish and the most comic booky, whereas his other Swamp Thing stories seem to be somewhat grounded. Like, the aliens really do feel like characters from a cartoon. And this one does have some humor in it, but the ending is absolutely heartbreaking. And there is actually some social commentary and philosophy. Now, Sean McManus illustrates this issue, and his artwork is very cartoonish, and I feel like it really works for this, whereas it didn't really work for the issue The Burial, which he also illustrated, and that one also had sort of a cartoonish style to it, but I don't think it worked for that one because that was a very dark Swamp Thing story. After Pog, you get the story Abandoned Houses, which, even though it does reference stuff that happened in the Arcane storyline, this also very much stands on its own. And this one actually ties directly in with the original Swamp Thing story, written by Len Wein and illustrated by Bernie Wrightson, which was published in the 1971 issue of House of Secrets. And that whole story is included in this issue as sort of a flashback. And this issue very much ties in with DC's horror anthology comics like House of Mystery and House of Secrets. And those comics had these 2 Crypt Keeper-like hosts, Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel actually show up in this issue. But basically the plot of this issue is Abby is dreaming, and she dreams she's at the House of Mystery and the House of Secrets. And she meets Cain and Abel, but ends up liking Abel a lot more than Cain, and Abel tells her the story of the Swamp Thing, but it's not Alec Holland's story. This is where you find out that Holland was not the first Swamp Thing. But this is a great issue because it really does expand upon the mythos of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. At the same time, it very much pays respect to the original creators of Swamp Thing, and it pays tribute to DC's horror anthology comics, but also works them into continuity. And there's some interesting implications here with Cain and Abel, where it's very much implied that these are the biblical Cain and Abel, where you get the idea that God is punishing Cain for being the first murderer and Abel for being the first victim by trapping them not in hell, but in the dream world, where they're doomed to tell stories for all eternity. Now, Neil Gaiman would make Cain and Abel characters in his Sandman series, which, while that series does stand on its own, it is very much set in the same continuity as this, so if you wanted to, you could look at the Sandman series as being a big sequel to Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. And I think it's safe to say that the Sandman comics probably wouldn't exist if not for these comics. I even saw an interview with Neil Gaiman once where he was talking about the 3 books that changed his life the most, and he actually included Alan Moore's entire run on Swamp Thing as the 3rd book that changed his life the most. Like, you could tell this whole series had a huge impact on him and had a huge influence on the Sandman series. In fact, Neil Gaiman actually writes the foreword for this edition of Volume 2. And the final issue collected in this volume is The Rite of Spring. I'm not going to say too much about the plotline of this issue, but this issue is absolutely beautiful. It's poetic, and it's also very psychedelic. And Pissette's artwork in this issue is just breathtaking. But yeah, I highly recommend Volume 2 of Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing. In this, he really does some very interesting storytelling. Now, I'm currently reading Volume 3 of this series, and that will be my next book review. But before I end this video, I want to play 2 short reviews that 2 friends of mine did on this book. The first short review was recorded by my friend Christian Feliciano, and the other short review was recorded by my friend Chris.
Alan Moore is a freaking genius. Let me just get that out the way, because if you read Saga of the Swamp Thing Volume 2, that's immediately what you think afterwards. You're like, this guy's a freaking genius. I mean, I remember picking up the issues of this book, back issues, of course, because I wasn't born, I don't think, when this stuff was coming out. But I remember reading it and falling instantly in love again, because Alan Moore was just, the first volume was amazing. Don't get me wrong. The first volume was amazing, but this is just, he takes stuff from the first volume and it carries over to this one. And you're just like, wow, all of that stuff that you were seeing in the first one leads up to this epic just story about going into hell and meeting Anton Arcane in hell. And of course, he has Etrigan the demon with him, and they're going to save Abby, and it's just, it's so beautiful. I love this book. The imagery is amazing. The artwork is fantastic. Writing, brilliant. I love Alan Moore's writing to death. He really gives these characters voices where, sometimes you read comics and it's fine, don't get me wrong, I love comic books to death and I love writers who do this, but sometimes you get into the point where everybody sounds the same. Alan Moore doesn't do that. He gives everybody their voice, and the way he writes Swamp Thing's dialogue is fantastic. The way he writes Etrigan, where he's rhyming and all this stuff, and he speaks very poetically, brilliant. And then when the Spectre comes in at some point, just everything just works out so brilliantly. I love everything that Alan Moore does. He really made this work. Now, if you haven't read the first volume, I highly recommend that you pick that one up before you read this one. Yes, you can jump on, I'm sure, and probably still understand it. However, it's just more meaningful if you read the first volume, because a lot of the stuff from the first volume carries over into this one, and you realize that Alan Moore really had a plan when he was writing that first book. He knew where he was going to take all the little seeds that he was planting in the first one. I mean, in the beginning of the first one, spoiler alert, you see that Anton Arcane is dead. In this one, you get to see Anton Arcane in hell, in all of his glory. Something humorous happens too, but I'm not going to get into it, but just, you'll like it when you see it. It's also disgusting too, but I mean, it's hell. What are you going to do? And also, what happens to Abby's husband, estranged husband, gets, fleshed out in this as well. Etrigan and Swamp Thing's friendship gets fleshed out here as well. In the first volume, which I didn't get into, Swamp Thing really, they show you how he's an elemental, how he can really talk to the green, as they call it nowadays, which is basically the vegetation of the earth. And they use that to some degree in this one. And like I said, if you read the first one, you'll understand it more. It'll mean more to you when you read it in this one. Everything in it just brilliant. You're gonna finish the book going, wow, this guy is just, he's a genius. Just like I said in the beginning. And that's my review of Swamp Thing Volume 2. Hope you guys enjoy it, and thank you, and bye.
So now going into book 2, the thing that we see is Alan really kind of letting go, and freeing it up for even crazier ideas. The return of Arcane is very disturbing, especially since we see it from Abby's point of view, and it's almost frightening to think that this dude was like willing to do this kind of shit to his own niece. But it's, that little Arcane trilogy, kind of like the big return of him in the stories in Matt's body. It's such a scary idea. So moving on from the Return of Arcane, then you go into that big dream sequence issue where you find out that Alec wasn't the first Swamp Thing. This is actually a thing he inherited. And then you kind of get a sense of where all this stuff is going to go in the future. It's not, Swamp Thing isn't just a monster, not just like a title that he adopted. It's actually a mantle that he's inherited, and it's going to keep going and going. And Alec is got to prepare for the future, for what being the Swamp Thing means to the world. And the way that he connects it back to the classic stories is pretty smart and pretty cool for the time. He even brings back like Cain and Abel, who hosted the House of Mystery and House of Secrets comics. He actually works them into continuity, and that's such a fun idea. And then, of course, that final issue with the whole like psychedelic dream sequence with Abby. It works so well as visual storytelling, but it also works as like this beautiful little love story, that caps things off of this particular book so well, because it's kind of a weird thing to acknowledge that this woman is in love with this monster, but okay, like here's a way that works in a way that's both ambitious and works for the story. It's weird to think of Alan as like a romantic writer, but he does do it well if you pay attention, especially with this issue, with like some of the stuff he's done in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. It's not what you'd expect from a Swamp Thing story, and it's really cool. I love it so much, that final issue. It's probably my favorite bit of the entire run, because it shows just the kind of crazy shit, yet also grounded and familiar and likable stuff that you could do with a comic book.